So the Suicide Squad by James Gunn recently hit the cinema, and dude, what an absolute blast. It's wild, it's wacky, it's raunchy. Once again, Gunn has orchestrated an emotional roller coaster ride full of twists and turns, out of an island of misfit toys with great synergy. The Suicide Squad is exactly what the uncensored James Gunn's sensibility would look like with a blockbuster budget, which is actually more similar to the R-rated films of Gunn's earlier career. And that leads me to his funky superhero comedy I want to talk about today, Super from 2010. To this date, Super still stands out to me as one of the best unconventional superhero films ever made. This movie shares a lot of similarities with another subversive superhero film that came out in the same year, Kick-Ass, even though Super received much less praises and attention. Both films feature nerdy, wannabe superheroes with no power and no special gadgets. Both films have silly comedy elements yet are filled with blood and violence. Both protagonists frequent comic book stores and get on local television. Both get helped by a younger female sidekick who saves his life, yet still try to win the heart of another girl. They both seem like the same film, although there are fundamental differences between them, which I will come back to later. But first of all, comparing Super with Kick-Ass, we can see a dramatic difference in their budget. Kick-Ass was made with a budget of 30 million USD, which was already 5 to 8 times lower than a usual Marvel film. While the budget of Super was only 2.5 million USD, about 15 times lower than Kick-Ass, and only 1.5% of the cost for Guardians of the Galaxy. Because James Gunn's treatment of Super wasn't like a blockbuster film at all. Instead, it's more like a unique combination of indie comedy and cult exploitation film.
And we come out of the gate saying this movie, Super, is not for everybody. It's for some people, and when you make a movie at a budget, you can afford to do that.
Super was made in the guerrilla filmmaking style within a tight period of only 24 days. And a fast-paced production rhythm had positively imbued Super with a confident and spontaneous energy. On one hand, it seems like a typical indie comedy flick that stars Rainn Wilson and Ellen Page just like Juno. It features tongue-in-cheek dialogues, one-liners, comical cartoon graphics, animated opening credits, and even Gunn's pop song curation with lyrics that verbalizes the characters' exact inner dialogues. But the film often swings in tone and turns into a campy exploitation film as well. Here, the origin of Gunn's filmmaking career at Troma Entertainment plays an influential role. Gunn was trained under Lloyd Kaufman, an underground B-movie master who made several iconic lowbrow superhero films, like The Toxic Avenger, Sergeant Kabukiman NYPD, and he also made a cameo in Super. Gunn co-wrote Kaufman's memoir, and from working with this cult film legend, Gunn's screenwriting debut, Romeo and Juliet, already captured his signature style in embryonic form. Full of over-the-top violence, gory horror, sexual bravado, and comical characters. Unafraid to be crass and inappropriate, yet still unexpectedly witty and Shakespearean in both the dramatic and poetic sense.
How would you like me to use your guts to Jackson Pollock the street, huh?
His later directorial debut, Slither, was a metaphor for Gunn's dissolving marriage, but it was also wrapped in the appearance of the skin-crawling 80s body horror film. Even when we examine the other scripts that James Gunn had written, from Dawn of the Dead to Scooby-Doo 1 and 2, to low-budget genre spoofs like The Specials or PG porn, to even video game Lollipop Chainsaw, traces of his Tromaville background were always present. Likewise, Super is a film with a strong comic presence, but also unapologetically wears its R rating like a badge of honor. The bone-crushing damage that the protagonist Frank Darbo commits with his pipe wrench is often simultaneously goofy and horrifying, almost as violent as The Punisher. The graphic tentacle fantasy sequence in Super was anticipated by the tentacled creatures in Slither, along with multiple surreal and gross nightmare scenes in Romeo and Juliet, a display of James Gunn's absurdly amusing imaginations. Following the logic of a gore horror, Gunn is not afraid to kill off characters in gruesome ways. The ugly death can seesaw from being shock comedy, to grisly horror, to heartbreaker that really packs an emotional punch. However, just the unorthodox genre flavor still doesn't get us to fully understand the heart of this film. Relating back to the Suicide Squad, James Gunn specifically wanted to fill the film with unknown second-rate antagonists, because he thinks there's an innate tragic element to supervillains who aren't even that good at being bad. Well, if the villains in the Suicide Squad are not good at being bad, then the heroes in Super are absolutely terrible at being good. Super may look like Kick-Ass on the surface, but the characters and the story here are in fact much darker. Although Kick-Ass also features dorky vigilantes pretending to be superheroes in flashy costume, at the heart of it, it's still a good versus evil story where the protagonist has altruistic intentions, defeats the villains, and gets the girl of his dream. Frank Darbo as the Crimson Bolt, however, is not only a loser, but also seriously psychotic. That's because both he and his partner Libby have an extremely idealistic and naive worldview, with their own definition of justice that doesn't fit with how the world works. Frank sees himself as Jesus' chosen one, and the school bullies or the drug dealers as the devils. But his clear-cut sense of ethics leads to his inability to differentiate serious offenses that need to be instantly addressed from relatively harmless misdemeanors that don't require punishment at all. Thus, his demented alter ego would severely injure or even kill people who conduct acts of minor inconvenience to the others, like butting in line. And the girl he's trying to win over, she's none other than his own wife Sarah, who doesn't love him and chose to leave him more than once, even though Frank idealizes her and sacrificed everything for her. From an outsider's perspective, it's easy to see that Frank has a white knight syndrome, which makes him predisposed to feel attracted to a damaged partner with a history of alcohol and drug addiction, and see himself as the only one who can save the damsel in distress.
What if Frank is the only thing that will save me? What then?
Upon examination, he is a wounded man who is battered by the trauma of his youth, including domestic abuse, religious sexual shame, school bullying, and repeated rejections from the opposite sex.
Must be some sort of sex thing with this motherfucker, huh? What? No.
Having lived such a repressed life, Frank is a man of contradictions. One moment he's watching hentai porn, and the next moment he's watching a Christian propaganda show, The Holy Avenger. He combines this oddly religious source of inspiration with his tentacle kink, thus forming a cosmic vision as his epiphany to start a superhero life. It appears as if Frank became a costumed hero because of his unshakable faith and conviction towards God's guidance. But actually, he just has a compulsive need to rescue the other people, which acts as a validation for his low self-esteem and a distraction from his powerlessness over his own life. In that regard, the way Super deconstructs our love for superheroes and places realism above heroism is ironically closer to the comic vision of Kick-Ass than the Kick-Ass movie itself. In the comic, Dave doesn't earn the affection from his crush Katie after confessing his secret identity, nor does his life improve after the big final mission, just like the sad ending of Super. Instead, it turns out that Hit Girl and Kick-Ass were fighting for absolutely nothing worthy at all, with no righteous justification. Hit Girl's father, Big Daddy, is also revealed to be a crazy comic book fanatic who was an accountant that hated his life. He lied about his entire backstory and invented his enemies, so that he and his daughter can live a more exhilarating superhero life, which is just like how Libby tries to live out her comic book dream by conducting overblown and gratuitous violence. Super is not the origin story of a superhero who's able to live up to the symbol that he represents. It's a dissection of a despondently bitter and broken man who is incredibly unfit to be a hero, trying to act like a hero in search of meaning. A theme that recalls Scorsese's Taxi Driver, which also features a dangerously lunatic countercultural anti-hero.
Yes, it's a superhero movie, but it's really a movie about a person.
When I further dug into James Gunn's lesser-known creative work, I was surprised to discover that Frank's character is also very similar to the protagonist of James Gunn's first and only novel, The Toy Collector, who's also named as James Gunn, a semi-autobiographical avatar of the author himself, who once worked as a hospital orderly, and dropped out of school because he did a lot of drinking and drugs until he hit rock bottom. The fictionalized James Gunn is a self-loathing, self-destructive wastrel who also works as an orderly and sells stolen pharmaceuticals to pay for his growing addiction of collecting expensive vintage action figures. On top of constantly lashing out, he also abuses sex, drugs, and alcohol, which wreaks havoc on both his life and intimate relationships. The literary style and the restless protagonist in The Toy Collector recall the transgressive fiction by Palahniuk. Through this brutally heart-wrenching tragicomic, Gunn created a nuanced and thoughtful psychological depiction of a young adult who still fears losing his inner child, even when his childhood and adolescence were messed up, and filled with trauma from sadistic bullies, abusive parents, and a friend who committed suicide. This was also partially based on the true stories of Gunn's childhood. Starting around 5th grade, his school was filled with bullies, peers having sex, drinking and doing drugs, which was influenced by the depraved school monsignor, who was passing young boys in his class alcohol and pornography, and even molested some of them. Gunn wasn't specifically targeted, but the experience was still scarring, especially when no adults in his life took it seriously. His Catholic home also had many alcoholics, including his father, which even made the family dysfunctional. Growing up surrounded by messed up people, it's not surprising that James Gunn developed a knack for dark humor which pervades the entire novel. Since he felt alienated and was disillusioned by the authority figures, Gunn burrowed further into his pop culture obsessions, including comic books, punk rock music, and horror, particularly the monster movies. He loved the monsters and even identified with them, since he has always felt like a lonely outcast who didn't belong anywhere. In the novel, Gunn sensitively navigates us through the emotional geography of an escapist just like himself who's trapped in the prison of his past. Collecting toys and constructing a world out of it is his coping mechanism to cover up for his life's disappointments, and recapture the few moments of beauty in his horrible yet still nostalgic childhood chronicles. Which is just like Frank's desperate effort to relive the only two positive memories in his miserable life: marrying his wife and pointing direction to a police officer to catch a thief. Although being an obsessed toy junkie who throws his life away or committing terrible crimes in the name of doing right are as damaging as the trauma these characters are trying to reconcile with, you would still root for these lost souls. Because most adults can relate to the complexity of dealing with one's childhood, how tricky it is to hold on to the innocence while grappling with trauma and accepting the responsibilities of growing up. And sometimes, returning to the simplicity and moral certainty of childhood seems to be the only way these eccentric outsiders can make sense of their world. The Toy Collector is a perverse, tormented, but powerful piece of work, and it was an obvious precursor of Super. James Gunn is not making excuses for his morally rotten protagonists, but he still tells their wistful stories in a non-judgmental way with a lot of genuine pathos. Unfortunately, Super was a very misunderstood movie, and the film hugely suffered in box office reception, to the point that Gunn even began to question his place in Hollywood. Funnily, that was when Marvel finally considered him as the director for Guardians of the Galaxy. The modern human-scaled approach to the superhero genre that Gunn has adopted in The Specials and Super captured the attention of a small fanbase including Joss Whedon, who saw this as a refreshing new voice. The puckish irreverence that had previously kept Gunn stuck on the perimeter of the industry injected new blood into MCU space opera, which were initially trying too hard to be Star Wars, making it the first Marvel film that was so intimately connected to the life experiences and personality of the director behind it. Star-Lord is a cheeky punk who disregards rules and loves the 70s and 80s rock. Drax the Destroyer is hilariously blunt, and Rocket has a mean sense of humor, all of them just like Gunn himself. In Guardians Volume 2, Star-Lord and Yondu developed a closer kinship, representing how Gunn finally resolved his issues with his flawed father in real life. Rocket also finally softened his edge and described how his offensive humor was only a defensive shell. James Gunn said that he had always been protecting himself by being either a provocateur or a comedian, but Guardians finally forced him to open up and become more vulnerable. And the film is really about how a dysfunctional family strangely evolves into a functional one, just like the dynamic between the 6 siblings from Gunn's family. It's comforting to see the growth of James Gunn's fictional outsiders, from the spiky and outrageous anti-heroes who are struggling through despair and inner turmoil, to the coolest faces of intergalactic justice who are finally starting to heal their inner child by building connections with others. Just like how Gunn himself has also come a long way from being the lonely outcast who identified with the monsters, to a cultural icon in superhero filmmaking who has repeatedly redeemed some of the lamest, most obscure characters from Marvel and DC into everybody's oddball favorite. He brings his affinity for the freaky and the fringe into the mainstream pop culture. And no matter how ridiculous or cartoonish the concept looks, no matter how weird or twisted the characters are, Gunn always manages to ground them in an emotionally realistic context where you can deeply empathize with their humanity. Through his visual magic, Gunn can even transcend those supposedly cheesy moments in the finale to a poetic and romantic level, invoking poignant well of deep feelings. James Gunn's latest success with The Suicide Squad and its touching climax scene has reminded me of Super again. In a way, Super is also an underdog film. but it is not necessarily an underdog film in the sense that the protagonist flips the script and wins by the end. Similar to the Suicide Squad, it is a wickedly fun celebration of the most despised, even morally degenerate group of losers who, despite everything, still live up to brief moments of glorious purpose and respectable dignity. And that is James Gunn's definition of super. What's up guys? If you like this piece of analysis on Super, be sure to hit the like and share button. You can also consider subscribing and hit the bell icon so that you won't miss out on any future videos like this. If you enjoy the Suicide Squad or Super or just James Gunn's filmography in general, leave a comment below. I would love to hear it. Other than that, thank you so much for watching and I will see you in the next video.